Hi, my name is Chiara Keys. I'm studying international and transnational criminal law, and I've been interning at Asymmetrical Haircuts since February. I've been asked to select podcast episodes that I think are particularly relevant to students of international law and conflict studies. My first pick is episode 112, The Road to a New Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. I chose this episode because it offers a clear and timely breakdown of efforts to create a dedicated treaty for crimes against humanity. It gives a great mix of legal depth and political context, perfect for students who want to understand how international criminal law develops at the treaty level. And listen through to the end, because my fellow intern and journalist Alex Davidson will bring you to the latest updates since we recorded the original in 2024. And here's the episode. Enjoy!
I think there is a massive gap in state responsibility, in having some way to hold a state to account, also to ensure that they actually have commitments and obligations to prevent something like this happening. So it's not just about down the road prosecution for atrocities such as this, but it's also to ensure that there's an obligation on states to make sure that they do as much as they can to prevent the commission of such crimes.
Medieval crimes are being committed.
I come with clean hands.
Victims of horrific crimes want justice.
We don't have anything better than this.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So there's a podcast that I've wanted to make for a while, but never seemed to have been able to actually make time. And that's on the idea that there should be a new treaty. Not the genocide, not the torture, but the crimes against humanity.
When you really think about it, it's weird that we don't have one yet.
Yeah, especially as all the crimes we get to report on in court, well, nearly all of them are, about crimes against humanity. Plus, I'm really kind of geekily intrigued by the idea that an individual or a group of individuals can kind of get together and via all kinds of deep and murky legal spaces that I don't understand, you can actually get states to do something new like that, and you can sort of change the world. Have a new treaty.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that you're not going to ask me to Stephopedia this one, because this is really not my specialist area. And every time I've heard about it, I thought, oh, this is interesting. I should really read up about it. And then, life gets in the way. So I'm here for this podcast and here to hear what all the experts have to tell me, so I don't have to do my own reading up.
Exactly. We can Stephopedia at the end. We can have a quiz for Steph at the end to see if she knows. But luckily, we have some deeply lovely legal nerds, if you don't mind me calling you that, to help us out on this. These are the kind of women that we keep on inviting back to the podcast because they're just so good at explaining stuff.
And they are also the ones who are getting this treaty done. So welcome Leila Sadat. She is the James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law at Washington University in St. Louis, and she was the Special Advisor on Crimes Against Humanity to the ICC prosecutor.
Great to be with you.
And hello, Priya Pillai, who's hot-footing it from yet another power breakfast. And I saw that picture of you with another podcaster, Rory Stewart, over at Yale, where you're currently some kind of a fellow. And I also know that you're the director of the Asia Justice Coalition. So welcome, Priya.
Thanks for having me.
So, Leila, why don't you kick us off? You must have done this a million times. What is it? And then we'll go on to where we are in the process. So what's the idea?
So first of all, thanks so much, Janet and Stephanie, for having me on. And I really haven't done this a million times. I've done it a few dozen maybe, but mostly recently. And the idea for a new Crimes Against Humanity Convention really originated, if you like, in the 1990s with a short article that Sharif Bassiouni wrote saying, it's shocking that we don't have this. But that was prior to the negotiation of the Rome Statute. And after that, pretty much all the energy of those of us working in international criminal justice was going into the creation of an international criminal court, which, as we know, took place in 1998, and the statute entered into force in 2002. So I suppose the question is, why now? Why do we still need it since we got the ICC and the ICC statute has crimes against humanity in it? And that's really the biggest question that I had to confront when I started the project in 2007 and 2008. And the impetus, in a way, for the project was the Bosnia versus Serbia case, where the International Court of Justice really took a look at what had happened in the former Yugoslavia and said, well, these are all terrible things, 100,000 dead, an alleged 50,000 rapes, torture, murder, arbitrary detention, etc. But actually, we have no jurisdiction over any of that because the only treaty that can give our court jurisdiction is something called the Genocide Convention. And when I read that, I turned to Sharif, who was still alive at the time, and Richard Goldstone and a handful of other people. And I said, we need to fill this gap. This gap is something that simply can't be allowed to stand. And it was quite difficult to convince others that there was a gap and that the gap could be filled or should be filled. And I think it was also because it was 2007, 2008. It was in direct proximity to the entry into force of the ICC statute. And there was both a protective element that people wanted to protect the International Criminal Court. And there was also this sense of, hey, we got the ICC, we're done. And unfortunately, just to fast forward to now we're in 2024, both of our predictions at the time came true, which is that the ICC would take very, very few cases, that it would have very, very limited jurisdiction, and that in spite of the enormous achievement that the ICC's establishment represented, we would still have a huge gap in our capacity to address international crimes.
And I think if I can just jump in and add a little bit to that, I think it's also sort of the need of the hour that, when we talk about the ICC, we talk about individual criminal responsibility of holding individual perpetrators to account. But I think there is a massive gap in state responsibility in having some way to hold a state to account, also to ensure that they actually have commitments and obligations to prevent something like this happening. So it's not just about down the road prosecution for atrocities such as this, but it's also to ensure that there's an obligation on states to make sure that they do as much as they can to prevent the commission of such crimes. So I think that's, again, an important legal gap that this draft treaty seeks to fill.
And I think the last kind of 6 months or year have really shown this gap again with the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, because that was also brought to the International Court of Justice, but then also under the Genocide Convention, because that is the only treaty that you can take the state responsibility to. And then there was a lot of outcry and people are going to say, is this genocide or not? You could say, well, we don't have this this is the only thing we have. And so you kind of see that, again, that gap is highlighted. Now you kind of can see in these current things why this treaty is important and why the ICJ, which is getting more attention, could do with such a treaty. But that's all fairly recent developments. How difficult was it for you to get this kind of idea of a treaty through the international system? Because you've been working on this a long time. Now we're finally getting to the talks about it. But in the preparation phase, none of this was actually happening. Ukraine, Russia, and Israel, Palestinians wasn't as much an issue as it is now. So do you see a difference in how it was received when you started it and how people are seeing the importance now?
Well, the short answer, of course, is yes. I still remember I had developed a PowerPoint presentation to explain to people this gap. And I had on my PowerPoint the 25 new things that this treaty could do that we can't currently do. And I remember, this is probably, 14 years ago, or maybe 13 years ago, and going to the ICC ASP in New York with my little PowerPoint presentation and sitting down with some of the important people in international criminal justice. And at the end of the 45 minutes, they'll say, okay, now you've convinced me, but, and the but was, of course, much bigger than the energy to move forward. And so what I recognize, Stephanie, is it's just going to take a while for ideas like this to take hold. Part of it was, as I said, the timing we were a little ahead of our time in that sense. Part of it was a fervent belief that the ICC would really change the landscape. It would change the way states behave and non-state actors behave. And it turns out it did so some of the time for some of the people, but not nearly enough to combat the level of criminality we're seeing. And the other thing, and I learned this really through my work as ICC special advisor, crimes against humanity it's really the workhorse of international criminal justice because it can attach to massive and systemic human rights abuses that take place in peacetime. You don't have to show this attack on the group, and it can also take place in wartime. And so if you look, and I did a big empirical study at the ICC, about 30% of the situations only are charging crimes against humanity. And that's so different than what we saw in the ad hoc tribunals where it was all about the war and the crimes against humanity were sort of ancillary to or auxiliary to the war. And to Priya's really important point, if you care about prevention, you really want to get at the criminality during peacetime. So I think we've had a recognition, we've had some experience at the ICC also to teach us what are crimes against humanity, why are they important. The ad hoc tribunals contributed enormously to our understanding of the crime. And so now it turns out that the time, for a whole lot of reasons, there's just a lot of coming together on this. Both fear about the degradation of global society with these terrible wars that are inflicting horrific civilian casualties, and also a sense that we have to redouble our efforts. And the coalition is really building. And thanks to people like Priya, it's a global coalition now. It's not just a handful of us running around New York with our PowerPoints or our advocacy.
Well, Priya, Leila says running around New York with PowerPoints, but it's actually inside, I understand, the number of committees, and really it's a process as far as I understand, and you need to tick an awful lot of different boxes. Without getting too technical, how does a treaty get made?
Okay, well, International Law 101? No, I won't go into nitty-gritty details, but...
I need it, Priya.
And just to let you know, I had a really interesting discussion yesterday with a group of Yale students, in this grand strategy class. And part of it was actually discussing crimes against humanity and the treaty making process. So I think very briefly on this treaty specifically, and Leila will attest to the amount of time and the effort that it's taken really to get to this point. But just a quick recap, where we are now is that the International Law Commission, which is this expert body that is responsible for the development and sort of evolution of international law, thanks to Leila's efforts and a lot of other academics who've sort of been talking about this initiative for many years, decided to take it on board as sort of one of the projects that they look at. And that is a big deal. It's a big deal that the ILC gets this on their agenda to really look at it in depth, to be able to give advice to states on, what the legal provisions are, what are the potential contours of a crime against humanity treaty. So we had a special rapporteur, Professor Sean Murphy, who worked on this for a few years, engaged, consulted with a variety of stakeholders, and then came up with essentially the blueprint, draft articles that were developed in 2019. And that's now the basis for moving forward. So what has to happen now is that the UN General Assembly has different committees. There's a sixth committee, which is the legal committee, which essentially is state representatives that, sit around a table, discuss what the ILC has sent to them as well. And the ILC has basically sent them this report, sent them a commentary on the draft articles and said, here you go, we've done the basic work. Now we think this needs to move forward into a treaty negotiation, that it is the right time. And we've done all the background work. So, we're basically giving you a product that is ready to go and to be negotiated. So at this point, the sixth committee has basically been sitting with the draft articles, has been mulling over what to do. They've had a 2-year period where they've discussed it in detail. There was a session this April. There's been a session last April. It's been a week-long session both times. States have had the opportunity to discuss substantively, based on sort of certain thematic pillars, what this treaty would be about, what are the issues they might have with it. as well as put in written submissions at the end of last year. So there's been a lot of engagement by states around this. But I think what is also critical is that there is a lot of mobilization now on behalf of civil society around the world as well, to say this is something that affects us directly. It's not just an esoteric legal discussion that happens in New York, but it is something that directly impacts, regions of the world that have mass atrocities committed against civilians in peacetime, in times of conflict, and that this is something that we need to see. So there's a much broader mobilization as well going on now that syncs up with what is happening in capitals, but also what's happening at the Sixth Committee.
I was just going to add just a little footnote to what Priya pointed out, which is one of my objectives as the project director, really from the outset, was that we would have a finished product to literally hand to the international community as an academic offering. And so we spent 3 years actually drafting a treaty. So we published a model convention, and it is available in 9 languages. And that did make it, we saw that once people could focus on an actual text, they began to see this more as something practical that could be useful, as opposed to sort of a pie in the sky idea. And the other thing is we then held regional meetings even before the International Law Commission. And then once the International Law Commission started, and Sean was able to use our text actually as a starting point, we held meetings in Peru. I went to South Africa. We went to Singapore. And so we really tried to engage in broad outreach. I think one of the most powerful moments was a meeting at Wilton Park that was hosted as part of the PSVI initiative by the UK. And Wilton Park held this meeting where they actually were able to bring in survivors, particularly survivors of sexual violence. And one of them said she finally understood the point of this was that she had a right to be free from the commission of these crimes. And that was a pretty pivotal moment in telling people you have a right not to have these crimes happen to you. It's not just some pie in the sky idea. It's that these are about your right as a human being to be free from this kind of violence, whether perpetrated by a state or by a non-state actor. And so I think as that idea has taken hold, we've also seen a much broader swath of civil society, including victims and survivors organizations, really take hold of this treaty and say, we want this because our rights are being violated. So it's been a very powerful partnership between academia, between the United Nations, between states willing to take leadership, and between civil society and victims organizations.
States are the ones that you're really trying to sell this to in a way because they have to sign on to it. What is your elevator pitch? Do you try to present it as brand new and groundbreaking because there's kind of new stuff in it that is not even in the ICC statute? Or are you trying to market it as a kind of technical tidy up that really should have been there, but by some strange blip hasn't, and we really need to codify that? Or does it really depend on who you have in front of you?
It's a little of both. I would say our project in particular, we tried to use already existing treaty language that states would be familiar with so that it didn't seem scary or too innovative. Because one of the concerns that states will naturally have, because crimes against humanity are often committed by states, is they want to know exactly what is permissible and what is not permissible. And so to the extent that we already have jurisprudence and legal text, we tried to keep our project relatively within the ambit of the existing legal framework. That said, what we did, which was, I think, quite innovative, and we'll see, the ILC copied it, and we'll see whether states continue it, is one of the things that have been missing with the sort of treaties on the jus cogens, the peremptory norms, genocide, serious war crimes. There is no treaty on crimes against humanity, but torture, right? Forced disappearance, is they don't have very strong interstate cooperation provisions. And since the whole point of this exercise is to hand it back to states and say, states, you have to do something about this. You have to prevent. And if you can't prevent, you have to punish and you have to cooperate with other states in punishing is we looked at the corruption treaty, the organized crime treaty, the treaties on transnational crime, and borrowed heavily from the provisions of those treaties in the mutual legal assistance provisions and extradition provisions of the proposed, the sort of the model draft that we published. The International Law Commission did the same. And what evolved from that is interesting, is the development of a new MLA treaty, which has yet to enter into force, but I'm sure it will eventually, that actually picked up that idea of having more robust interstate cooperation provisions with respect to core crimes, right? These important crimes.
I'm just going to break in briefly to say MLA is Mutual Legal Assistance, and we did a podcast about it, which we will link to in the show notes for our listeners.
Yeah, we're going to come back to all of these things. You've mentioned so many aspects that we need to come back to, Leila, but I just want to bring Priya in to start with, to ask in terms of that kind of, as Stephanie said, selling it. What's in it for Asian states? I mean, are they interested? Are they joining the discussions? They're not the most active states in terms of international criminal justice, in terms of membership of the ICC, for example. But, where's your part of the world positioning itself in relation to this?
That's a great question. And I think, it's been a mixed bag. Let me put it that way. I think there are a number of states that actually in Asia have taken leadership, but actually let me rewind a little bit. In terms of the region, I mean, it's a huge, it's a region with sort of a lot of diversity, but it's also a region that has witnessed the commission of grave atrocities. You've got Cambodia, you've got Myanmar right now, we've got what's happening in Afghanistan, we've got a lot of these situations that really cry out for some sort of redress and that would really fit the textbook definition of crimes against humanity. And then there's this legal gap, to your point, Janet, as well. There's the fact that this is the region that has the lowest ratification of all regions of the Rome Statute as well. So there's a massive legal gap. If you look at most domestic jurisdictions within this region, a lot of them do not have mass atrocity crimes that are incorporated into domestic legislation. So they're really not prosecutable. So that's all to lay out the reason why this is really important for the region. I think in terms of actions that governments have taken, you've got some states that have been very active and quite vocal about the need for this. And those include Bangladesh, South Korea, Mauritius, the previous governments of Myanmar and Afghanistan. We've got, a fairly robust engagement from some states. And in fact, the three co-facilitators of the April sessions that the Sixth Committee has had, one of the facilitators was actually Malaysia, who's also stepped up and said, yes, we really need this in the region. The other two states that have expressed support are the Philippines and Thailand. States have talked about support for this, but that they also have questions around the treaty. They have questions around definitions. So they are open to discussion. And we've got a few states that are sort of neutral, that have spoken on the floor, Singapore, Indonesia, Japan, that in principle we think would support it, but again, have a few questions that they hopefully have had clarified in these 2 years that the Sixth Committee has, had these in-depth discussions. We also have a large group of states that have not engaged too much, but I see that as potentially not that negative, that these are states that are still thinking about it, that can still be convinced, that we can still engage with them and talk to them. You've got a lot of Pacific and small island states that are interested in ecocide, interested in sort of some of the new and novel concepts that might be part of this draft convention as well. So there are different interests that different states have. But I would say as a whole, there's been relatively positive engagement, but I think we're hoping that more states will step up and realize the importance of this really for the region. And I think that will also come if there's a greater groundswell of lawyers, activists, people in the region really stepping up and saying, look, we think it is time and it is important for us to have this in place.
Now, Janet wanted to put this episode in her gender series. How are the discussions for this Treaty for Crimes Against Humanity kind of related to the idea of gender justice, and what are the kind of controversies we see around there?
I think it fits nicely. And that sort of brings me both to Priya's comment and to my earlier elevator speech. I'm terrible at elevator speeches. Okay. I don't give them. But the thing that was important in getting this far was to give states something they were familiar with. This isn't so different. It is, in a sense, a technical wrap up that will complete a missing gap. But what we've seen through the process is that for those who feel that the current framework leaves out the specific kinds of harm that they're concerned about, this treaty presents a real opportunity to improve upon what they see as deficiencies or to concretize gains that have already been made with respect to the existing law. So in terms of gender, one of the things that's been proposed is the inclusion of forced marriage as a specific crime. Why? Because 3 international criminal tribunals and courts have said it is, in fact, a crime against humanity as an other inhumane act, that residual category. And so what they'd like to see is the crystallization of that norm that's been articulated now by 3 different courts, the Cambodia Tribunal, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and the ICC. They want that in the treaty because they feel it's time. There are others looking at things like environmental crimes. Priya mentioned the ecocide movement. The environmental crime idea is not new. It was there in 1996 when the International Law Commission developed its draft code of crimes that it thought would accompany the draft ICC statute that it had written in 1994. And they debated whether environmental crime should be a crime against humanity and ultimately decided not to include it. Some states tried to push it forward during the Rome negotiations. It wasn't time. Now I think there's a huge amount of energy around environmental crimes and the need to recognize that the harm to the environment is an extraordinary cost of war, of human rights violations, of abuses. And personally, I think it's excellent to put it into crimes against humanity. It is a peacetime crime, right? So you don't have to have a war to have a massive environmental crime. And human beings are part of the environment. So I don't have an objection to it conceptually. Some of the ecocide people want a separate 5th crime, but I think including it in crimes against humanity could be very useful. Similarly, there's been calls for a new crime of gender apartheid or recognition of what people think is the crime of gender apartheid. That's responding to specific facts on the ground in Afghanistan in particular, and somewhat in Iran, where we've seen civil society. This has come sort of bottom up rather than top down, where women in those society are saying this is a new crime that's happened to us. And we know that often codification in treaties does respond to what happened. The Genocide Convention basically codified what happened in the Shoah. Sierra Leone has said we need to include the slave trade. It is one of the clearly missing things in the Rome Statute. It's actually in the Slavery Convention and somehow didn't make it into the ICC statute. And so for them, that's a very important fix, if you like, that is well grounded in customary international law and should be included in the new treaty. So one of the things that will happen, assuming this does go to negotiations and we have a big decision that has to be taken this fall by the 6th committee, whether or not to send it to negotiations. We're cautiously optimistic. We can talk about that. Will be, okay, now we're in negotiations. Now let's figure out what this treaty is going to have. So I think the feeling of groups with respect to gender, it's why it does fit well, Janet, because people are worried that even with the improvements we have thus far, there's still a gap. The Al Hassan judgment was disappointing from the ICC in the sense that the gender persecution claims were rejected, essentially. And so there's a sense that we still have work to do, and this new treaty is the opportunity perhaps to do it.
I'm going to accept the hat that's been given me. It's also, for me, it's bottom up because it's just feels like something that a lot of people are talking about. The same reason why we've done Little Climate series, that because all these activists are talking about it, we want to understand it ourselves. So another little follow up on gender. About the Rome Statute itself, it feels to me like this discussion at the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty is also a way of kind of redressing what some people say is a flaw in the Rome Statute, that it doesn't reflect current understanding of the social constructions of gender, and your potential treaty would be able to actually put the idea of the crime of persecution on gender grounds sort of much more solidly as a norm. Maybe I've mangled how to sort of understand that, but is that your understanding, Leila? Is that why this is also such a big issue for people?
So my understanding is a little bit different, Janet. I do think that is the understanding. I do think there is a sort of campaign to get a conceptualization of gender. For example, the International Law Commission deleted Article 7, subparagraph 3, which is the definition of gender in the Rome Statute. They deleted that from their draft, and most states are happy with that, but there's a small vocal minority that says we actually want it back. What I would say is I think with respect to the lack of sensitivity or the lack of success, if we want to be clearer about prosecuting crimes of sexual and gender-based violence. At the ICC, I think there are two problems that really don't relate to our treaty. And one is the modes of liability at the ICC, which I think I've written about this with Patty Sellers and Susanna Sokoto. I think the ICC has particularly high thresholds and high barriers to prosecution that's making it impossible. And the other is that many of the judges in their own minds haven't recognized the importance of sexual and gender-based violence. You have some judges very, very committed to doing that. We know that people matter, and the ICC just could do better. I think Prosecutor Bensouda was amazing on this. She ran into problems in the Bemba case. We didn't get prosecutions in Katanga, convictions on sexual and gender-based violence. I think Karim is making another run at it, but I think it's sort of structural in the ICC statute and in the personnel actually applying the statute. The new treaty is not going to fix that. It's unique to the Rome Statute. The new treaty is going to be applied by states. So in states with a progressive view on gender as a social construct, I think the new treaty does offer them a real opportunity to, in their national systems, build upon that idea with respect to the concept of crimes against humanity and violence that's either sexual and gender-based violence, violence relating to sexual orientation, etc. Some states that have more conservative views are going to incorporate the treaty in a way that I think gender advocates may not like, but it is something that is offered to states for implementation in their national legal system. So there will be a diversity of approaches, and that is appropriate, right? It is not a global cultural imposition that is going to be worldwide. There is going to be contestation during the discussions, and there has to be some respect. That doesn't mean that crimes can be committed or violence against women and girls is acceptable. It does mean that there will be some national differences. And what we have told states, because there is some contestation around this issue in the discussions now in the 6th committee, and states are expressing their views, if that makes sense. The ICC in its global, the ICC can be forward leaning. It can be a leader on gender. The Karim has now published 2 additional policies on this. And neither, by the way, has really taken up what I see as the key structural flaw of the application of the Rome Statute, which is modes of liability, which is how do you actually link the guys you're trying or the people you're trying to convict with the crimes on the ground if they weren't actually the physical perpetrators of the crimes. The ad hoc tribunals used joint criminal enterprise liability, and it was very successful. And I do feel frustrated that the ICC has adopted this very limiting approach to the prosecution of gender-based crimes, because it is a very It's one of those things that looks objectively neutral. And in fact, it's heavily gendered in its application. So the failure at the ICC, I think, isn't really coming from the definitions in the Rome Statute. It's coming from the application of the definitions. But I do think that there can be gender advances that will be acceptable to all states or most states that can be incorporated in the new treaty. And I think that's very exciting to people that feel frustrated with the ICC.
Priya, if we look a bit at the practicalities of this new treaty, now the way I look at it and covering ICJ cases from here, I think, well, if you have this new treaty, that means we're going to see a huge bump in ICJ cases. All those who can't go to the genocide are now, there's already a lot of movement where there's kind of a roundabout way to address human rights abuses through the ICJ, with the anti-discrimination treaty being a popular one, also now the Genocide Convention. But is it only for ICJ, or will this treaty also have effect on the national jurisdictions of countries, and how will we see that?
So when you look at the draft articles, there's an Article 15, which is the settlement of disputes article. And this provision essentially mirrors the Genocide Convention. So basically what it means is that you have the option, for states to enter into negotiation linked to violations or linked to the obligations of this treaty. And I'm going to call it a treaty right now for the purposes of this podcast. And of course, if that fails, to submit it to the ICJ or arbitration, as the case may be. So there is a provision, there's a dispute resolution clause in this treaty for interstate disputes. So a bit similar to the Genocide Convention. I mean, I think now that the ICJ has opened the door to erga omnes obligations, this is something that could well be used as well in a similar manner. But what I would say is also really, really important about this treaty as well is the fact that you've got very clear, very explicit obligations on states to do certain things within their territory. So, as Leila has pointed out before, there's an obligation to cooperate. So that is encapsulated in a very detailed provision in this treaty as well, which talks about legal assistance. How do you coordinate between some countries where really the job lies with, say, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the others, it's the Ministry of, Judicial Affairs. How do you coordinate? It gives a blueprint to states to actually be able to coordinate in a more effective manner. But also there are very important provisions within the draft article, which talks about the fact that this should not be essentially something that allows safe haven for alleged perpetrators. So you have an obligation to extradite, you have an obligation to prosecute, that you have to do something. It is not feasible, it is not permissible under this treaty that you actually have a perpetrator who's on your territory, or you have a link to that perpetrator and you do nothing, right? So I think really the fact that the obligation to prosecute or extradite is encapsulated in these provisions is really important as well. And that there is this, explicit recognition of what has been happening in some other instances where you've had, ad hoc state cooperation, where in some cases states have followed through, in some cases they really haven't followed through. Here, it's in writing, it's an obligation that states need to follow through, and that they need to ensure that there is no safe haven for perpetrators of crimes against humanity. So I think that's a critical part that we should not forget. It's not just about the ICJ and interstate disputes, but it's also about what happens within states and domestic jurisdiction, and how states are meant to sort of distill and exercise these obligations.
I want to come back to something Priya said too, which is the importance of prevention. And one of the things that the draft articles do, or the draft treaty, let's call it that, is they require states to prevent crimes against humanity. And the question